saying that exactly right. This harkens back to the American idea. That America's founding, the founding fathers said, look, our Constitution is only good for moral people. If we're immoral, we're going to lose our freedom. And so the way I see it is if we lose the shared sense of what is moral, then the state takes more and more control to try to control it, even as we kind of have a more morally degenerate or decaying society. And that's what I see happening. I mean, there's a lot of ideas about morality, but we're having more and more laws to deal with it because people don't have a shared sense of what's moral. And I think in this sense, the founding fathers were constrained. They couldn't really see outside of their Judeo-Christian heritage, right? They saw morality as being what is biblically moral. Now in our society, if you say what is moral, so it's biblically moral, everyone goes, I don't think so. So there's this moral chaos. And in that moral chaos, we get more and more laws. Well, to me, faith enhances it because I think it makes me happy to believe that my life matters. Not just in a transient way, in a temporal way, or a way from right now it matters because I'm hungry and I want to eat, but in an eternal way. I think that my life matters. And I believe that. I think that is tremendously satisfying. And I think this is one of the stark realities for people that don't believe in a transcendent God is ultimately there is no meaning. It's the survival of the fittest, and whichever side wins is right. We saw that in the 20th century with struggles between communism, fascism, democracy, and other things. If the communists would have prevailed all over the world and created a one-world government, there's no one there intellectually who can challenge that and say this is wrong. Because there's other intellectuals that say, no, it's not wrong, it's right. And we're the fittest, we're imposing our will, and we're surviving. That's the calculus. The way to escape that, of course, is you need to, from a logical point of view, you need to say, wait, there's an authority above what we see and touch in this world. There's a higher authority. Well, one thing too, I think there's a big loose end there too, because, correct me if I'm wrong, and we'll clarify, but I identified a bunch of the leaders in the Darwinian movement, if you could label it like that, from the 19th century to the 20th century to now. And so part of the question is, well, is it really fair to characterize the movement by these guys? Because they're so extreme. And I think that's another question that we should give serious consideration to is like, what is the fair way to characterize the movement if it's not by what the leaders themselves say the movement is? And to me, I think that the leaders of a movement pull everyone along incrementally, little by little by little, and all of a sudden the followers realize they're in a radically different place, and they never even notice it. Because the extreme leaders have been pulling them that way for 100 years. And so I think it is justified to look at what the leaders are saying and to see what directions they're putting in play. And I think to me, it seems indisputable that what these leaders are saying is what's influencing public policy right now.
Do you distinguish, or how do you distinguish between Darwinian faith, or Darwinism, versus evolution? I think one is a scientific theory and one is a philosophical theory that there's a relationship there, but they're not necessarily connected.
Right. I think that's a really great question. And I think where we have to go back to, we've got to go back to the 19th century. We say here Darwin wrote on the origin of species by means of natural selection, and he put forth a theory on biological change. And like I said, he himself wasn't really anti-God. He didn't see it as being anti-God. The atheist philosophers of the day promoted it big time. I mean, Huxley and Nietzsche and all those guys took it and ran it, right? So they interpreted that theory in a philosophical way. And it's very, very ironic Because what's happened, I think, when we study this issue is we see that, guess what? Christians are the ones always being accused of injecting our faith into science. But guess what? It's been exactly the opposite. Since the start of Darwinism, it has been the atheists that have injected their language into the science of biology. And so I think you're right. It's a philosophy of atheism that has been injected into Darwinism, and it should be separated back out. And we should be able to look at biological origins for what they are, scientifically, as biological origins, and then draw, in my mind, more thoughtful implications from that. Let me continue for one more step from there. This is a step from what your question is, but then the question becomes, can we draw philosophical implications from empirical evidence? Right? And I think we can. And I'm willing to make the case that the conclusions that the atheists have drawn are not in accordance with the empirical evidence. When we look at the complexity of subatomic particles, the complexity of atoms, the complexity of molecules, the complexity of living cells, and those systems, and the most simple living cell in the world, we still haven't even fathomed how they work at the deepest level. Not only that, then we look at how a whole biological system works with multiple cells, and then we discover, oh gee, not only that, there's information in the heart of every living cell called DNA that codes for the proteins, and that regulates the proteins, and that repairs the cell and does all this stuff. I think there's strong empirical evidence there to support a design inference in the universe. So I think it is valid to draw philosophical conclusions from empirical evidence whilst being diligent to separate that you're now talking philosophy. But in my mind, the empirical evidence supports a strong design inference.
Okay, so you pointed out how our culture is declining here, and can we look back in history and see, has this happened somewhere else? This similar occurrence, and what was the result?
I don't know if I can. I'm not really a historian. I guess I could say that it's true that civilizations rise and fall, and I think we could probably make the argument that civilizations rise when there's a sound moral and philosophical basis on which to build, and that civilizations tend to decline when that moral and philosophical foundation erodes. The classic Roman analogy comes to mind, and the parallels now, especially just in the last 10 years, have become so striking. I mean, throwing bread to the masses to keep them happy. The sexual depravity around the border problems they have. It's kind of eerie just about the similarities. But that's kind of a cliche, I know, but I think there is some validity there, but I'm not, without going into detail, because I'm not really that well versed in history. I could maybe offer another piece of information that might generate questions. I alluded to the empirical evidence that is kind of stacked up against Darwinism in the presentation. And I want to address that real quickly with the preface that I don't think the empirical evidence against Darwinism is black and white. I mean, I think there is strong evidence for common descent.
Darwinism or evolution?
Darwinism. There's strong evidence for common descent. Even in the last few years when with genetic advances in knowledge and all that, we can track mutations through different animals and things that look similar. And so I don't want to myself say, the evolution or the evidence against Darwinism is all there, there's nothing supporting it. I don't see it that way at all. But I do think it's interesting that there is a tremendous amount of empirical evidence that goes against Darwinism that is kind of glossed over in our science textbooks and in our schools that is not being brought up. And three very quick areas. These are just areas, but in abiogenesis, for example, the gap between life and non-life now, in terms of our knowledge and theory, is only widening. The textbooks still allude to like a primordial pond with lightning striking in and some kind of proto-cell kind of going. That has totally fallen apart. We don't have a clue how life began. And now, because of our growing knowledge of the complexity of early cells, it's really a mystery. So that's number one. Darwinism fails to explain abiogenesis, and that's very clear. Number two is the fossil record. Most of the animal types we know appeared in the Cambrian explosion without any evolutionary history, about 550 million years ago. So those animal types appeared suddenly and fully formed, and it's really a mystery. And then Darwin acknowledged that, but he thought that more paleontology and other discoveries would they'd fill in the gaps. That hasn't happened. All over the world and all the continents, right during the Cambrian explosion, all kinds of different animal types appear really suddenly, which is very un-Darwinian. And then thirdly, when it comes to genetics, the heart and soul of Darwinism now is that random genetic mutations create genetic information, create more complexity, create more functionality. And that premise, although the Darwinists defend it vigorously, the literature and other things, it's really coming under attack, because it's very hard to imagine how mutagenic chemicals or random genetic mutations coming from space particles or other things hitting a genome create more functionality or more complexity. In fact, it seems more and more apparent that the opposite occurs. It's the genetic processes are degenerative and conservative, meaning the genetic reproduction happens, whether it's meiosis or mitosis, precisely, digit for digit. It's like a digital code to the next generation. So it's conservative in that sense. And then when mutations happen, they're very degenerative and destructive. So those are just three areas, and it's not black and white, and there's a lot of complexities. But the idea that Darwinism is sound empirically is really, I think, something that the new generation of biologists. It's fun to read the literature. It's not very Darwinian. They say it is in the boilerplate at the beginning, but then they discuss it, and it's other theories altogether. So that's really fun.
In your book, you gave a kind of a picture of an example of what that might look like with the phone book. That's just easy to picture. Could you share that with us?
Yeah. Okay, a genome. It's a lot of information. And the information is very precise. Every single bit of DNA data is either an AT, it's adenine and thymine, or it's a CG, cytosine and guanine. So that's the binary bits, AT or CG. Every three of those code or a codon, right? And together they code for a certain amino acid. Together they code for proteins that create all the proteins for our biological structures. So what happens is, it turns out, is that a lot of times, if you get one digit wrong, a lot of times the protein itself is rendered totally useless. So it has to be very, very precise, especially the exons, the ones that code for proteins. So in a way, that's like a phone book, because a phone book has a tremendous amount of information. I think the human genome has 3 billion bits, if I'm remembering that right. You can look it up and check it. I think it's about 3 billion bits of DNA, bits of information that are code for all the proteins. Okay. A phone book has all kinds of very well-organized, precise information in it. And so, if you think about a phone book and you say, okay, how's this phone book going to get better, more useful, more functional? And you think, okay, well, maybe it'll happen if it undergoes random variation and change. So you throw a phone book out and maybe a page gets torn out here or there. Or maybe some numbers get jumbled here or there. Or maybe there's a shift in between names on this page and this page. So Darwinism says that random change in highly organized information makes it better. But if you think about a phone book, it's how does that make it better? It screws it up. And in fact, that's exactly what the empirical evidence shows. When you have a genetic,
There's no natural selection on framework. There's no pressure on framework to change an error in printing. Do you think that there's natural selection and pressure on organisms?
yes, and I'm glad you brought that up. Because when you really start to think about it, you say, what is selection? Selection just means what? Something dies, right?
Something that are better suited.
Something is selected over something else. It has nothing to do with whether or not there's greater functionality created.
No, doesn't.
So there's still the root question there. But let's take that a step further, because you're asking a fair question in terms of, I think another way to state it is
The phone book
that
is
Darwinism,
interesting, but I don't think it applies to living systems.
well,
It's like that, it's like rolling dice.
let me go into the next thing, because I think what we're really, what we're really saying is this.
Usually we have French fries in front of us.
Yeah. No, this is really good, and this is a great question to sort out, because this is the defense. This is the state of the argument right now, at least as I understand it. This is the state of the argument. Darwinists say, wait a second, yeah, 99.9% of all genetic mutations are destructive, but some of them could be positive. It might be rare, but some of them are positive. And if something is positive, then guess what? The organism that has a positive mutation, that confers to that organism a survival advantage. And that survival advantage, then that organism is changed a little bit, right? And so that's random variation, and I think that's the heart of your question, right? Now, but let's look at how that plays out. There's a great book out, if any of you want to read Michael Behe's latest work. It's called, I'll come to me in a second, but he deals with this question a lot, and he deals with it mostly in microbiology with malaria, with AIDS, and with staph, and the single cell organisms, because single cell organisms are often put forth as a good example of Darwinism, because they undergo so many generations and so many mutations. We can see Darwinism at work, right? And that's the argument that's made. The interesting thing is, what they're noticing is that even if there's we can observe millions of generations of these things and lots of mutations, when a mutation happens that's positive, like let's say a staph cell becomes immune to an antibiotic, what actually is happening there is genetic information is lost. That's the advantage. And what's more is there's never any morphological change. There's not morphological change, so there's variation, but you never see in nature or in the fossil record or anything like, say, a trilobite changing into a vertebrate or a fish. You never see that. And you never see a staph cell, say, changing into an amoeba or anything like that. There's never any morphological change. Another example that is often put forth is, say, Darwin's finches, right? Darwin's finches are, hey, here's an example of Darwinism. You can see variation happening. And in different environments, whether it's raining a lot or whatever, the generations of finches will start having longer beaks, right? But then the environment changed back, and the beaks changed back. And so there's not a morphological change, and what they're learning is that, wait, that there isn't new genetic information being created. The genes are just expressing themselves in a different way. And when those genes start expressing themselves in a different way, then it goes, oh, that's the whole epigenetic function. What is causing those genes to be expressed that way? And what we're learning about the genome is it's extremely purposeful. So in a simplistic way, I think the phone book analogy is relevant for a general understanding of the degenerative nature of genetic mutations. But also what we're learning is this. Guess what? The genome is a lot more than a phone book. It's not like a database here with information in a computer. The genome is actually the processor in the computer. The genome looks at the information, rearranges the information, splices information, creates information to send it to different parts of the cell. So the idea that the genome is a